At 2021 hours, local time, deep inside Russia's core territory in the Leningrad region, more than 620 miles from the Ukrainian border, a Vyriy-10 TFL-1 drone entered its final dive toward the target. The target was now only 800 feet away. In just 10 more seconds, 8 pounds of shaped explosive would slam directly into Russia's largest Trinitrotoluene production line. But that was only the opening shot. With the entire base already pushed to the highest alert level, the question was whether the Russian operating teams could identify and intercept the remaining drone in time, especially before it delivered the decisive finishing blow. But the answer to that had in fact already been determined 48 hours earlier, even as Russia's billion-dollar satellites continued to sweep the sky without pause. Because Ukraine's plan did not begin in the air. It began on the ground, quietly concealed inside an entirely ordinary-looking heavy cargo tractor trailer. It all began with a contract that appeared in an online black market group, hiring a local Russian driver to carry out what seemed like an entirely ordinary delivery, hauling a prefabricated wooden cabin across 900 miles of territory. That driver had absolutely no idea that the cargo he was transporting was in fact a mobile launch platform. Beneath that camouflaged wooden shell, a Ukrainian insider agent was secretly completing the assembly of a GOGOL-M mother drone system, along with its full payload of 2 Vyriy-10 attack drones. The brilliance of this plan did not stop at the method of transport. What was truly formidable also lay in the advanced camouflage technology integrated into the drones. The Vyriy-10 was equipped with an LED system capable of generating a thermal signature identical to that of a Sparrow, with the heat level tuned to sit just 1 degree above the surrounding environment. As a result, to a Russian radar operator only glancing across the screen, it would not appear as a dangerous target, but simply as a harmless wild creature. The all-or-nothing stakes of this operation were absolutely staggering. The objective was to turn an $800 million factory into an inferno, while immediately choking off more than 40% of the explosive output Russia was using on the Zaporizhia and Sumy fronts. To do that, Ukraine had to send the decisive shot past a goalkeeper that had almost never let anything through. Guarding the approach was the Panzer S-1, an extremely dangerous mainstay air defense shield with a 12-mile kill zone specially designed to hunt down low-flying targets. Working in coordination with that system was the Protivnik-GE radar, a radar built specifically to hunt targets with an extremely small radar cross-section, exactly the kind of signature produced by the Vyriy-10. Covering the entire area was the Moskva-1, a powerful electronic warfare system capable of jamming GPS, severing control links, and even degrading the enemy's radar capability. To punch through that wall of steel and silicon, Ukraine's plan could not afford even a single margin of error. 2 days before that moment, the operation had officially begun. A heavy tractor trailer with an entirely ordinary appearance quietly merged into the traffic flow on the M12 highway. On paper, the cargo inside was declared only as components of a prefabricated cabin, but in reality, what was rattling inside that container was anything but ordinary. Under the faint light cast by a battery-powered flashlight, a Ukrainian agent quietly assembled each component of the GOGOL-M. The container had been reinforced with a layer of military-grade thermal insulation, enough to conceal the agent's body heat, along with the extremely small amount of heat emitted by the electronic equipment from any roadside inspection. At the same time, a GPS spoofing device continuously transmitted deceptive signals, making the truck's entire declaration profile appear completely legitimate. Its route remained fully updated inside the official system. And throughout that exhausting 900-mile journey, the truck quietly blended into the dense sea of vehicles as if it were only one of thousands of other ordinary deliveries. An invisible ghost was moving right through the enemy's own logistics system. When the truck was only 70 miles from the Morozov plant, it suddenly broke away from the main route and moved into a deserted open field. As dusk fell, part of the container roof quietly slid aside. The GOGOL-M, now fully fitted out, immediately lifted off vertically in the twilight, its electric motors running so quietly they were almost silent. It held an altitude of only about 70 feet, following the low terrain of the Svir River Valley in order to remain below the detection threshold of Russia's long-range S-400 systems. The package had effectively arrived, but from this point on, the GOGOL-M still had to cross 70 miles of enemy airspace. The key question was this: could it reach the drone release point in time before the more sensitive, short-range defensive layers around the factory detected its presence? At 2013 hours local time, inside the command cabin of a Panzer S-1 system, the familiar steady scanning rhythm on the operator's screen was suddenly broken. A weak and flickering signal unexpectedly appeared, moving along the direction of the Svir River. It was moving too slowly to be a missile, too large to be dismissed as a bird, and also flying far too low for any conventional aircraft. The system's algorithm flagged the target as an unidentified biological entity, but the operator's instinct warned him of something entirely different. The commander inside the vehicle, clearly irritated by the alert, gave a cold order. Fire one missile first, see if it reacts. The 57 E6 round immediately screamed out, launching violently from the mount in a brutal surge. But the target was not flying blind. The onboard LAR system instantly detected the launch and calculated the missile's flight path. The mother drone immediately dropped another 30 feet, pressing itself down until it was almost skimming its belly across the water's surface. The missile continued tracking the altitude the drone had just left, tearing through the air above it before exploding uselessly over a dam far ahead. On the Russian screen, every alert suddenly turned bright red. The target was immediately reclassified as a top-tier hostile threat. The boredom inside the command cabin vanished in an instant, replaced by panic. Over the radio, the commander's voice suddenly snapped, almost breaking apart. Activate the Moskva-1 at full power. Deploy the SSO to the ground immediately. Moments later, a violent blanket of electronic jamming covered the sky. It was a coercive effort to sever every connection between the drone and its operator. Within just minutes, 300 SSO troops had been deployed into position, establishing a 6-mile containment ring around the factory. The element of surprise was effectively gone. At this point, the GOGOL-M was charging straight into an electronic storm while also facing the tightening encirclement of Russia's most elite forces. Its mission was not to attack directly, but to release the deadly payload it was carrying. The only remaining question was whether that trap had already closed too early. At 2016 hours local time, as it drove straight into the core of the Moskva-1 jamming zone, the GOGOL-M was now like a beast forced into a corner. But that was exactly why it was there, to open the battle. With a short hydraulic hiss, the belly doors of the mother drone snapped open, releasing two Vyriy-10s directly into the center of the electronic chaos. From the Russian side, this should have been the finishing blow. The electronic warfare bubble of the Moskva-1 had been created precisely to sever control links and disrupt GPS signals, turning any drone into a useless mass of metal in the sky. And in the first 60 seconds, that system did exactly what it was supposed to do. The GPS signals of the Vyriy-10s began to flicker, then disappeared completely. But there was one detail the Russian side had not anticipated. Those drones were no longer receiving commands from the outside. They had already switched into a state of autonomous operation using their own brains. The control system immediately shifted automatically into the Phantom AI protocol. The LED lights embedded in the drone bodies began to flash, emitting a thermal signature calculated with precision only 1 degree Fahrenheit higher than the body heat of a real sparrow. At the same time, the drone's electronic brain, trained on thousands of hours of bird flight data taken from the Pava Museum archive, officially took over full control authority. The two drones began making continuous micro-corrections, about 3 degrees per second, recreating almost perfectly the wavering flight path of a bird struggling against the wind. That was the counter-strike through intelligence. The sophisticated MTI filtering system of the Panzer S-1, programmed to eliminate clutter signals from the ground and wild animals, immediately classified those tiny movements as harmless biological targets. On the Russian radar screens, the two signals nearly dissolved completely into the background clutter. The operators could only stare at an almost empty display in a state close to total blindness. One of them blurted out, unable to hide his astonishment, "They're flying like they're in the 13th floor." They had pierced the first layer of defense not with overwhelming firepower, but with absolute audacity and creativity. But that very act of technological defiance triggered an even more terrifying response. The moment it became clear that the ground radar had been fooled, the Russian command immediately played its strongest card, a Beriev. A 100 patrolling at 32,000 feet was ordered to scan the entire area. Its powerful downward-looking thermal imaging system did not care what kind of flight path the targets were following. The only thing it was hunting was heat. At 2018 hours, local time, from the very moment the Beriev A-100 was ordered to redirect its mission, the fate of the two drones was almost sealed. At 32,000 feet, the battlefield looked entirely different. The BEREEV's powerful thermal sensors were not influenced by flight pattern or MTI effects. They saw the world only through traces of heat. An analyst aboard the aircraft almost immediately marked two signals. They were extremely small, but the heat radiating from them, faint as it was, still carried the clear signature of an artificial source. The Beriev had now become the guiding eyes for the Panzer S-1. Thanks to a direct data link providing firing parameters, the ground crew no longer needed to lock the targets with their own radar. All that remained was to fire. A blazing 57 E-6 missile shot upward, tearing through the night sky and driving straight toward the lead drone. The threat warning receiver on the Vyriy-10 immediately shrieked sharply. With less than a second left to respond, the drone activated the final maneuver that had been programmed in advance, a suicidal dive. It plunged hard down to 40 feet, the ground rising violently right in front of its nose, while the distance to the factory wall was now only 600 feet. But the moment it escaped one trap, it flew straight into another. Below, 300 Russian SSO troops were not sitting idle. They had erected a crude but extremely effective layer of defense. Steel cables stretched tight by motors between tree trunks and support poles, spinning continuously into a web that could snag any target flying close to the ground. The mission had now been pushed to the final threshold. The lead drone was caught in a deadly pincer. Above it, a 57 E-6 missile was plunging down. Below it, the spinning steel net was already waiting. If it could not get through this choke point, the entire plan would collapse right at the factory gate. At that point, the operation would end, not with a precise strike, but with a failure strangled inside Russia's final defensive layer. At 2020 hours local time, as the 57 E-6 came tearing in through the air at 2,900 miles per hour, the Vyriy-10 was forced to reveal its final card. It was precisely because of this worst-case scenario that this drone had been selected from the start, carrying a special feature reserved for use only at a life-or-death moment like this. The drone's control system now shifted completely from navigation status into pure target hunting mode. The AI inside cut off all outside guidance and immediately activated its image recognition homing protocol. From that moment on, the drones were no longer charging toward a pre-programmed coordinate. Instead, their optical cameras began scanning the face of the building, continuously comparing the captured image against the 3D model stored in memory in order to find one and only one impact point, the main air intake of the Trinitrotoluene drying section. The moment the 57 E-6 came screaming straight in, the drone's forward LAR system locked onto the illumination signal and completed the intercept calculation in only a few millionths of a second. Its AI did not react like an instinctive dodge. It processed the situation as a problem to be solved. With a single brutally sharp lateral brake, the Vyriy-10S made the missile pass by within a hair's breadth. The 57 E-6's proximity fuse, optimized to kill much larger targets, failed to meet the conditions needed to activate, and the missile ripped uselessly through the air before self-destructing in the vast sky above. At the same time, the AI also found the solution to the threat from the steel net. Its strike point was not on the ground below. The ventilation opening was placed 30 feet high on the main wall, well above the crude steel net raised by the SSO troops, and more importantly, there was no fiber optic cable for the enemy to trace back to the control source. At that moment, the two drones truly were two ghosts. There was no operator left who could be tracked, and the GOGOL-M, immediately after completing the deployment of its payload, banked sharply, turned its nose around, and quickly withdrew back toward the safe area. As the lead drone began locking in its final 8-second terminal run, the remaining Vyriy-10, circling in wait at a distance of half a mile, immediately received a short automated command, "Wait for the flashing signal." The role of the lead drone was to turn the first column of smoke and sea of fire into a giant beacon, immune to jamming, to guide the remaining drone in for the finishing blow. Once the factory's defensive layer was ripped open in those few seconds of chaos, the game was effectively decided. At that exact moment, he activated the unit's secret card, a tracked unmanned ground vehicle carrying a thermobaric charge. They had not come to rescue anyone. They were the follow-on wave, ready to surge in and exploit the moment of chaos. Once the factory's defensive layer was smashed open, the game was effectively decided. All that remained was to deliver the final blow to bring down the king on the 64-square board. At 2021 hours local time, the Vyriy-10 accelerated violently, its camera locking hard onto the distinctive shape of the ventilation shaft. In the final 4 seconds, the entire flight path became almost nothing but streaks blurred by speed. The 8-pound shaped charge punched through the steel mesh at the main air intake of the Trinitrotoluene section and drove 12 feet deep into the ducting system before the truly terrifying part of the attack began. The blast shook the entire factory, and a towering column of fire erupted, tearing open the night sky like New Year's fireworks launched months too early before the turn of the year. But the true brilliance did not lie simply in the fact that the strike had landed. It lay in the physics of the explosion itself. This was the real dissection of a perfect killing blow. First was the fuse. It had been set with a precise delay of 0.9 seconds. Why was that necessary? Because if it detonated the moment it touched the target, most of its force would be wasted on the building's outer shell. That delay allowed the drone to penetrate deeper into the facility before exploding. The aim was not simply to punch a hole. The aim was to lock the shockwave inside the exact space where it could inflict the greatest level of destruction. Second was the way the energy was released. What followed was no different from 60 pounds of TNT detonating inside a completely sealed pipe. With nowhere to escape, the 600 pounds per square inches pressure wave slammed directly into the reinforced concrete walls, then rebounded back, amplifying its own destructive force. The entire drying section was turned into a giant pressure cooker, as if the power of Thor had been trapped inside a honey jar. That pressure did not merely crush machinery. It also snapped the building's load-bearing frame. Concrete columns designed to carry vertical loads shattered like toothpicks under the horizontal shock waves sweeping through them. And when the main roof collapsed, the entire production line beneath it was buried as well. Within seconds, the entire Trinitrotoluene section had been deformed into a field of wreckage filled with twisted metal, shattered concrete, and rolling columns of smoke. Finally came the chain of secondary effects. The explosion burned through all of the factory's key power supply lines. The lights were not simply cut off. The entire electrical system almost completely collapsed, falling into a state of paralysis like clinical death, plunging the whole base into darkness and absolute silence. In those conditions, the SSO units were trapped inside a thick cloud of toxic smoke, without electricity, without communications, almost stripped of every sense on the battlefield. They rushed frantically through the choking haze while the alarm sirens wailed without pause through the night. All of it unfolded amid a desperate effort to construct the story that this had been nothing more than an industrial accident during routine work. The next morning, Russian state media described the incident only as a minor technical malfunction. But high above, beyond the range of sight, a U.S. NRO satellite captured images of a crater 60 feet wide, enough to expose the truth that the so-called malfunction was in fact the result of an attack by 2 drones carrying 8-pound warheads. However, the destructive power of that explosion was not confined to the factory alone. It quickly revealed itself as part of a much larger picture: Ukraine's strategy to cripple Russia's weapons production capacity by striking directly at the logistical and industrial choke points deep behind the front line. This strike was not aimed at a single target and then over. The real objective was to choke the entire supply network feeding Moscow's war machine. At that same moment, Ukrainian UAVs also launched additional waves of strikes against the Moscow region and several military airfields in Crimea, forcing Russian air defenses to immediately disperse their forces, shift their axis of response, and split their firepower across multiple directions. For that reason, this cannot be seen as an isolated battle. It was one link in a tightly coordinated campaign designed to stretch the Russian air defense umbrella, disrupt its response tempo, and erode the very industrial foundations supporting the battlefield. The psychological shock created by this strike was even greater than the material damage. Afterward, Russian commanders were left so tense that even any flock of birds crossing the sky was instantly viewed with suspicion. With only 2 tiny AI-guided sparrows and a completely harmless-looking tractor trailer, Ukraine exposed a core law of modern warfare. The side that gains the advantage is not necessarily the one that possesses the most expensive weapons, but the one willing to employ them in the boldest and most unexpected way. And that is also the lesson left behind by this entire operation. In today's war, the most dangerous threat sometimes appears under the most ordinary disguise. And now, try putting yourself in the position of an operations analyst. If this were a scenario in a military documentary, in your view, what kind of disguise would make the tractor trailer attract less attention? A mobile coffee truck or a fruit delivery truck for a supermarket? Leave your opinion in the comments. And if you want to follow more analysis of bold tactics and the technologies reshaping the face of the modern battlefield, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next videos.